to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @Snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. In doing so, you help new listeners find us and sleep better as well. Also, we very much enjoy reading them. This episode is brought to you by Arboretums. Tonight, we'll read from The Wild Garden by William Robinson, published in 1870. Robinson was an Irish gardener and journalist whose ideas about wild gardening spurred the movement that led to the popularising of the English cottage garden. He was a champion of the wild garden who vanquished the high Victorian pattern garden of planted-out bedding schemes which used tropical plants grown in greenhouses. Modern gardening practices first introduced by Robinson include using alpine plants in rock gardens, dense plantings of perennials and groundcovers that expose no bare soil, use of hardy perennials and native plants, and large plantings of perennials in natural-looking drifts. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Plants chiefly fitted for the wild garden. What first suggested the idea of the wild garden, and even the name to me, was a desire to provide a home for a great number of exotic plants that are unfitted for garden culture in the old sense. Many of these plants have great beauty when in flower, and perhaps at other seasons, but they are frequently so free and vigorous in growth that they overrun and destroy all their more delicate neighbors. Many, too, are so coarse that they are objectionable in choice borders, and after flowering, they leave a blank or a mass of unsightly stems. These plants are unsightly in gardens, and the main cause of the neglect of hardy flowers, yet many are beautiful at certain stages. A tall harebell, for example, stiffly tied up in a garden border, as has been the fashion where plants of this kind have been grown at all, is at best at times an unsightly object. But the same plant growing amongst the long grass in a thin wood is lovely. The goldenrods and daisies used to overrun the old mixed border, and were with it abolished. But even the poorest of these, seen together in a New England wood in autumn, form a picture. So also, there are numerous exotic plants of which the individual flowers may not be so striking, but which, grown in groups and colonies, and seen at some little distance off, afford beautiful aspects of vegetation, and quite new so far as gardens are concerned. When I first wrote this book, not one of these plants was in cultivation outside botanic gardens. It was even considered by the best friends of hardy flowers a mistake to recommend one of them, for they knew that it was the predominance of these weedy, vigorous subjects that made people give up hardy flowers for the sake of the glare of bedding plants. Therefore, the wild garden in the case of these particular plants opens up to us a new world of infinite and strange beauty. In it, every plant vigorous enough not to require the care of the cultivator or a choice place in the mixed border will find a home. Of such plants there are numbers in every northern and mountainous country, which travelers may gather and afterwards grow in their own gardens. The herbaceous kinds of Aurelia from the American woods, with fine foliage, the wormwood family, the stronger kinds of American cottonweed, certain of the vigorous species of asparagus, asters, and their allies in great variety, certain of the larger species of Botanica, pretty and with delicate flowers, but hardly fit for the mixed border, various free and vigorous exotic grasses, the handsome creeping bindweeds, too free in the garden, the most vigorous campanula, exotic thistles, and their allies, the more remarkable kinds of carex, somewhat too coarse for the garden, are chiefly suitable for the wild garden. The common shrubbery, woods, and woodland drives. It must not be thought that the wild garden can only be formed in places where there is some extent of rough pleasure ground. Excellent results may be obtained from the system in comparatively small gardens, on the fringes of shrubberies and marginal plantations, open spaces between shrubs, the surface of beds of rhododendrons, where we may have plant beauty instead of garden graveyards. I call garden graveyards the dug shrubbery borders which one sees in nearly all gardens, public or private. Every shrubbery and plantation surface that is so needlessly and relentlessly dug over by the gardener every winter may be embellished in the way I propose, as well as wild places. The custom of digging shrubbery borders prevails now in every garden, and there is in the whole course of gardening no worse or more profitless custom. When winter is once come, almost every gardener, although animated with the best intentions, simply prepares to make war upon the roots of everything in his shrubbery border. The generally accepted practice is to trim and often to mutilate the shrubs, and to dig all over the surface that must be full of feeding roots. Delicate half-rooted shrubs are disturbed. Herbaceous plants are destroyed. Bulbs are displaced and injured. The roots as well as the tops of shrubs are mutilated, and a sparse, depopulated aspect is given to the margins, while the only improvement that is effected by the process is the annual darkening of the surface by the upturned earth. Illustrations of these bad practices occur by miles in our London parks in winter. Walk through any of them at that season and observe the borders around masses of shrubs, choice and otherwise. Instead of finding the earth covered, or nearly covered, with vegetation close to the margin, and each individual plant developed into something like a fair specimen of its kind, we find a spread of recently dug ground, and the plants upon it with an air of having recently suffered from a whirlwind, or some calamity that necessitated the removal of mutilated branches. Rough pruners precede the diggers and bravely trim in the shrubs for them so that nothing may be in the way. And then come the diggers, plunging their spades deeply about plants, shrubs, or trees. The first shower that occurs after this digging exposes a whole network of torn up roots. There is no relief to the spectacle. The same thing occurs everywhere, in botanic gardens as well as in our large West End parks, and year after year is the process repeated. While such is the case, it will be impossible to have an agreeable or interesting margin to a shrubbery or plantation. What secrets one might have in the central hidden portions of these now dug and bare shrubberies, in the half-shady spots where little colonies of rare, exotic wildlings might have their first introduction to our wild garden. Of course, all the labor required to produce this miserable result of dug borders is worse than thrown away, as the shrubberies would do better if left alone. And by utilizing the power thus wasted, we might highly beautify the positions that are now so ugly. If we resolve that no annual manuring or digging is to be permitted, nobody will grudge a thorough preparation at first. When a plantation of shrubs is quite young, it is well to keep the ground open by lightly stirring it for a year or two. Then the planting should be so arranged as to defeat the digger. To graduate the vegetation from the taller subjects behind to the very margin of the grass is of much importance, and this could be done best by the greater use of dwarf evergreens. Happily, there is quite enough of these to be had suitable for every soil. Light, moist, peaty, or sandy soils, where such things as the sweet-scented Daphne neorum, known as garland flower, would spread forth its dwarf cushions, would be somewhat more desirable than, say, a stiff clay, but for every position suitable plants might be found. In one spot, we might have a wide-spreading tuft of the prostrate savin pushing its graceful evergreen branchlets out over the grass. In another, the dwarf little cotoneasters might be allowed to form the front rank, relieved in their turn by pegged-down roses, and so on without end. Herbaceous plants that die down in winter and leave the ground bare afterwards should not be assigned any important position near the front. Evergreen alpine plants and shrubs, as remarked before, are perfectly suitable here, but the true herbaceous type and the larger bulbs, like lilies, should be in groups between spreading shrubs. By so placing them, we should not only secure a far more satisfactory general effect, but highly improve the aspect of the herbaceous plants themselves. To carry out such planting properly, a little more time at first and a great deal more taste than are now employed would be required. But what a difference in the result! All that the well-covered borders would require would be an occasional weeding or thinning, and, in the case of the more select spots, a little top dressing with fine soil. Here and there, between and amongst the plants, such things as forget-me-nots and violets, snowdrops and primroses might be scattered about, so as to give the borders interest even at the dullest seasons, and thus we should be delivered from digging and dreariness, and see our once ugly borders alive with flowers. The chief rule should be, never show the naked earth. Clothe it, and then allow the taller plants to rise in their own way through the turf or spray. Here is a little sketch of what is meant. A colony of the white arabis carpets the ground in which strong, hardy lilies are growing, and the lilies are pushing up their bold, unfolding shoots. The latter are none the worse in winter for this light carpet of foliage over the border, and then for a long time in spring it is bedecked with white flowers. Indeed, in fairly good seasons it blooms in winter too. It would take a big book to tell all the charms and merits belonging to the use of a variety of small plants to carpet the ground beneath and between those of larger growth. It need hardly be said that this argument against digging applies to 2 or 3 beds of shrubs, and places where the shrubbery is little larger than the dining room, as much as to the large country seat, public park, or botanic garden. There are great cultural advantages, too, in leaving the whole of the leaves to nourish the ground and protect it from frost or heat. When 1 or 2 species prevail in a given spot, in that way we may secure several important ends, distinct effects in different places, a variety as we walk along, and better means of meeting the wants of a plant, inasmuch as, dealing with a group or mass or carpet, we can best observe the result of our judgment in putting them in any soil or place. Therefore, although the quantity of vigorous, hardy flowers essential for making good effects in a place of this size has not yet been planted out, some very charming effects have been obtained. Many are already planted, but will be some time before they show their full beauty. Among them, Japanese and other honeysuckles, Virginian creepers, clematis, wisterias, and others. A part of the arboretum is more particularly devoted to this kind of decoration, and will eventually form a very wild wood and wild garden where the poet's narcissus may be found among sweetbriars, lilacs, and many kinds of fragrant flowering shrubs and vigorous perennials. While carrying out the scheme of wild gardening, pure and simple, that is to say, the naturalization of foreign hardy plants, opportunity has been taken to establish beautiful native kinds where they do not happen to be present in sufficient abundance. Thus, the lily of the valley has been brought in quantities and planted in wide-spreading colonies along the drives, and so have the meadow saffron and the snowflakes and the daffodils. To group and scatter these in a natural and easy way has required considerable care, the tendency of the men being invariably, and almost in spite of themselves, to plant in stiff and set or too regular masses. Few things are more delightful to anybody who cares about hardy plants than naturalizing the lily of the valley in pleasant spots about a country house. It is in every garden, of course, and very often so crowded and so starved that it seldom flowers well. A bare garden border is not so suitable for it as that in which it may be found in a thin wood, or in little openings in a copse, where it enjoys enough light and gets shelter too. Frequently, the fresh wood soil would be more welcome to it than the worn-out soil in a garden. Also, by planting it in various positions and soils, we may secure an important difference as regards blooming. In a cool, woody place, it would bloom 10 days later than in an exposed, warm garden border. And this difference could be increased by carefully selecting the position. Apart altogether from the wild garden and its charms, this difference in the time of blooming of the lily of the valley would be a great advantage to all who provide cut flowers, inasmuch as it would give them late bloom in plenty without trouble. However, giving reasons for the naturalization of the lily of the valley is surely unnecessary. The only surprising thing is that it has not been done to a large extent already, because it is so very easy and so very delightful. Recently, a good many different varieties of lily of the valley, nearly as many as 20, have been collected and are beginning to be cultivated by some of our growers of herbaceous plants. The difference in these is not owing to soil or situation. When grown in the same place, they manifest differences in length of spike and size of foliage, and also in time of blooming. In some, the spike is short, and in others, nearly 1 foot long. This important fact should, of course, be noted by any who would, in places where the lily of the valley does not grow wild, interest themselves in establishing it. There are advantages in wood culture for many hardy plants. The shelter, shade, and soil affording for some things conditions more suitable than our gardens. The warmth of the wood, too, is an advantage, the fallen leaves helping to protect the plants in all ways. In a hot country, plants that love cool places could be grown in a wood where they would perish if exposed. Placing every plant in one border with the same conditions as to soil and exposure was a great mistake. A great many beautiful plants haunt the woods, and we cannot change their nature easily. Even if we should grow them in open places, their bloom will not be so enduring as in the wood. A little woodland planting may indeed be worth doing for the sake of the prolonged or later bloom, even from places and plants that thrive in sunny spots. The brookside, waterside, and bog gardens. Nearly all landscape gardeners seem to have put a higher value on the lake or fish pond than on the brook as an ornament to the garden. But while we allow that many places are enhanced in beauty and dignity by a broad expanse of water, many pictures might be formed by taking advantage of a brook as it meanders through woody glade or meadow. No such beauty is afforded by a pond or lake, which gives us water in repose. imprisoned water, in fact. And although we obtain breath by confining water, still, in many cases, we prefer the brook, or water in motion, as it ripples between mossy rocks or flower-fringed banks. The brook margin, too, offers opportunities to lovers of hardy flowers which few other situations can rival. Hitherto, we have only used in and near such places aquatic or bog plants, and of these usually a very meager selection. But the improvement of the brook side will be most readily effected by planting the banks with hardy flowers, making it a wild garden, in fact. A great number of our finest herbaceous plants, from irises to globe flowers, thrive best in the moist soil found in such positions. Numbers of hardy flowers, also, that do not in nature prefer such soil, would exist in perfect health in it. The wild garden, illustrated by the waterside, will give us some of the most charming garden pictures. Land plants would have this advantage over water ones, that we could fix their position, whereas water plants are apt to spread everywhere. And sometimes one kind exterminates the rest. Therefore it might, in many cases, be better not to encourage the water or waterside vegetation, but to form little colonies of hardy flowers along the banks. The plants, of course, should be such as would grow freely among grass and take care of themselves. If different types of vegetation were encouraged on each side of the water, the effect would be all the better. The common way of repeating a favorite plant at intervals would spoil all. Groups of free, hardy things, different in each place as one passed, would be best. An interesting point in favor of the wild garden is the succession of effects which it may afford, showing a succession of life on the same spot of ground. In gardens in early summer at present, the whole of the portion devoted to flower gardening is dug up raw as a plowed field, just when the earth is naturally most thickly strewn with flowers. A very little consideration and observation would suffice to make it clear that a succession of effects may be secured without this violent disfigurement of our gardens in the fairest days of the early summer. These are not the days for digging or planting either, and the system that necessitates them is pernicious in its effects on our gardens. It is equally an enemy of all peace or rest for the gardener who, having trenched, dug, enriched, planted, and sown through the autumn, winter, and spring, might certainly begin to look for the fruits and flowers of his labor, when he has to face the most trying effort of all, the planting of the flower garden in May and June with a host of flowers too tender to be committed to the earth at an earlier season. The bog garden is a home for the numerous children of the wild that will not thrive on our harsh, bare, and dry garden borders, but must be cushioned on moss and associated with their own relatives in moist peat soil. Many beautiful plants, like the wind gentian and creeping harebell, grow on our own bogs and marshes, much as these are now encroached upon. But even those acquainted with the beauty of the plants of our own bogs have, as a rule, but a feeble notion of the multitude of charming plants, natives of northern and temperate countries, whose home is the open marsh or boggy wood. In our own country, we have been so long encroaching upon the bogs that some of us come to regard them as exceptional tracts all over the world. But when one travels in new countries in northern climes, one soon learns what a vast extent of the world's surface was at one time covered with bogs. In North America, day after day, even by the margins of the railroads, one sees the vivid blooms of the cardinal flower springing erect from the wet, peaty hollows. Far under the shady woods stretch the black bog pools, the ground between being so shaky that you move a few steps with difficulty. One wonders how the trees exist with their roots in such a bath. And where the forest vegetation disappears, the American pitcher plant, golden club, water arum, and a host of other handsome and interesting bog plants cover the ground for hundreds of acres, with perhaps an occasional slender bush of laurel magnolia among them. In some parts of Canada, where the painfully long and straight roads are often made through woody swamps, and where the few scattered and poor habitations offer little to cheer the traveler, he will, if a lover of plants, find conservatories of beauty in the ditches and pools of black water beside the road, fringed with the sweet-scented buttonbush, with a profusion of stately ferns, and often filled with masses of the pretty Sagittarius. Southwards and seawards, the bog flowers become tropical in size and brilliancy, as in the splendid kinds of herbaceous hibiscus, while far north and west and south along the mountains, the beautiful and showy moccasin flower grows the queen of the peat bog. Then, in California, all along the Sierras, there are a number of delicate little annual plants growing in small mountain bogs long after the plains have become quite parched, and annual vegetation has quite disappeared from them. But who shall record the beauty and interest of the flowers of the wide-spreading marshlands of this globe of ours, from those of the vast, wet woods of America, dark and brown, and hidden from the sunbeams, to those of the breezy uplands of the high Alps, far above the woods, where the little bogs teem with nature's most brilliant flowers, joyous in the sun. No unworthily, for many mountain swamp regions are as yet as little known to us as those of the Himalaya, with their giant primroses and many strange and lovely flowers. One thing, however, we may gather from our small experiences, that many plants commonly termed alpine and found on high mountains are true bog plants. This must be clear to anyone who has seen our pretty bird's eye primrose in the wet mountain-side bogs of Westmoreland, or the Bavarian gentian in the spongy soil by alpine rivulets in the snow ooze. Bogs are neither found or desired in or near our gardens nowadays, but wherever they are, there are many handsome flowers from other countries that will thrive in them as freely as in their native wastelands. Ditches and narrow shady lanes, copses, hedgerows, and thickets. People usually seek sunny positions for their gardens, so that even those obliged to be contented with the north side of the hill would scarcely appreciate some of the above-named positions. What, the gloomy and weedy dike as a garden? Yes, there are ditches, dry and wet, in every district. They may readily be made more beautiful than many a modern flower garden. But what would grow in them? Many of the beautiful wood and shade-loving plants of our own and similar latitudes, things that love not the open, sunny hillsides or wide meadows, but take shelter in the stillness of deep woods or in dark valleys, are happy deep within riven rocks, and gaily occupy the little dark caves beneath the great boulders on many a mountain gorge, and which garland with inimitable grace the vast flanks of rock that guard the dark courses of the rivers on their paths through the hills. And as these dark walls, ruined by ceaseless pulse of the torrent, are beautiful exceedingly, how much more may we all make the shady dikes and narrow lanes that occur everywhere. For while the nymph gardener of the ravine may depend for her novelties on the stray grains of seeds brought in the moss by the robin when building her nest, or on the mercy of the hurrying wave, we may place side by side the snowy white wood lily, whose home is in the shades of the American woods, with the twin flower of Scotland and Northern Europe, and find both thrive on the same spot in happy companionship. And so in innumerable instances. And not only may we be assured of numbers of the most beautiful plants of other countries thriving in deep ditches and in like positions, but also that not a few of them, like the white wood lily, will thrive much better in them than in any position in garden borders. This plant, when in perfection, has a flower as fair as any white lily, while it is seldom a foot high, but, in consequence of being a shade-loving and wood plant, it usually perishes in the ordinary garden border or bed, while in a shady dike or any like position it will be found to thrive as well as in its native woods. And if in deep, free, sandy, or vegetable soil, to grow so as not to be surpassed in loveliness by anything seen in our stoves or greenhouses. Our wildflowers take possession of the stiff, formal, and shorn hedges that seam the land, often draping them with such inimitable grace that half the conservatories in the country, with their collections of small red pots and small mean plants, are stiff and poor compared with a few yards' length of their blossomy verdure. The wild roses, purple vetch, honeysuckle, and the virgin's bower clamber above smaller but not less pretty wildlings and throw a veil of graceful life over the mutilated shrubs, reminding us of the plant life in the nest-like thickets of dwarf shrubs that one often meets on the high alpine meadows. In these bushes, in a sea of grass, one may gather flowers after they have been all browsed down on the turf. Next to the most interesting aspects of alpine vegetation, there is perhaps nothing in the world of plant life more lovely than the delicate tracery of low climbing things wedded to the bushes in all northern and temperate regions of the earth. Perishing like the grass, they are happy and safe in the earth's bosom in winter. In spring, they come up as the buds swell, and soon after, finding the bushes once more enjoyable, rush over them as joyously as children from school over a meadow of cowslips. Over bush, over brake, on mountain or lowland copse, holding on with delicate but unyielding grasp, they engrave themselves on the mind as the central type of grace. In addition to climbing pea flowers, of which the stems perish in winter, we have the great tribes of wild vines, noble in foliage and often in fruit. The numerous honeysuckles, from coral red to pale yellow, all beautiful, and the clematis, rich, varied, and lovely beyond description, from those of which each petal reminds one of the wing of some huge tropical butterfly, to those with small flowers born in showers like drops from a fountain jet, and often sweet as hawthorn blossoms. In nature, we frequently see a honeysuckle clambering up through an old hawthorn tree, and then struggling with it as to which should produce the greatest profusion of blossoms. But in gardens, not yet. Some may say that this cannot be done in gardens, but it can be done infinitely better in gardens than it has ever been done in nature, because for gardens we can select plants from many